Welcome to the PrisonPod, a podcast for all people experiencing incarceration. The mission of this podcast is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism. Many show ideas come directly from the listeners, so please write the host. PrisonPod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473. Here is your host, Ms. Valerie.
Welcome to the PrisonPod. Today's guest is Sobanan Narenthiran, joining us from England. We are going to talk to him about his life and how quickly it changed from studying to be a doctor to being an incarcerated person. He takes his experiences and education and applies them to make systemic change. I'd like to welcome you to today's show, Sobanan.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
And I hope I didn't totally ruin your name.
That was a really good attempt. It was actually really good. You took your time and it was actually, absolutely spot on.
Thank you. Yes, we're really excited to have you here today. For our listeners, he's across the pond, quite a ways away, in 5 hours difference in time. So I really appreciate him joining us today. So would you like to start off telling us a little bit about what you do today as far as your work, and then we'll go backwards.
All right, sounds good. So my name's Sobanan and I'm the CEO of Breakthrough Social Enterprise. So we're an organization that bridges the gap between today's talent and tomorrow's industries. So what this means in practice is working with underserved communities across the world to help them understand how emerging technologies and both like a lifelong education, but also life skills can help them to prepare for the digital economy. So our key outcome is this idea of digital economic readiness. And that takes up most of my time.
And if people want to find out more information about that, do you have a website?
Yeah, so we are breakthrough.org or .co.uk. We are Breakthrough as it sounds, so UEAREBREAKTHROUGH. First time I have to spell that. But that is our website. And if you type in Breakthrough Social Enterprise or search my name up on Google, you should be able to find us relatively easily.
So that wasn't the work that you were thinking about when you were a young man in high school getting ready to start out in the world. You had these great aspirations of becoming a doctor, is that right?
Yeah, I think I realized I wanted to become a doctor when I was like 14, 15. So in the UK, we have something called the NHS, the National Health Service. Healthcare is meant to be free at the point of entry. And that's always been something quite inspirational for me is I'm a big believer in that universal healthcare. So that's really what kind of pushed me in the direction of wanting to become a doctor in the first place.
I wish we had that in the US. Healthcare is one of our most costly things.
Yes.
So it's quite different. So now you were in school and you had plans on going to college. Can you tell me a little bit about what changed that direction?
Yeah, of course. So I had finished my A-levels, or I guess that's finishing high school or sixth form in the UK, then went off to university to study medicine. And it was 2.5 years into my degree that I was actually convicted of a conspiracy to supply cannabis and sent to prison. That was what I guess derailed my ambitions of becoming a doctor. But I guess that journey started off much younger. I think growing up in London, like many cities, I'm sure across the US as well, has that mix of people from ethnic minority or global majority communities being sort of integrated with what you consider, I don't know, urban crime or whatever else. And I think a lot of what was considered normal there also became normal at university, which is sort of where one thing led to another. And I was sent to prison with my best mate at the time. So it was not something I expected, but something that happened, I guess.
I'm curious, did you actually serve time in the same place with your friend?
Yeah, so he got less time than me because he pled guilty and you get discounts for guilty pleas. And I'm sure you get the same in the US. It's a good way of keeping the court system from overfilling, right? But so he got 2 years, I got 2 years, 8 months. We served, so he had to serve 7.5 months before he came out on tag. And so we served quite a bit of his sentence together. And then, I was on my own for the rest of it.
And I can imagine that this was pretty shocking to your system, going from, I would assume, a fairly stable life at home with your future pretty much planned out for you. And then the rug was kind of pulled out from underneath you. What was that experience like when this all happened?
In a way, it compare it to a death of some sort, because you have this sense of identity and sense of self before you go to prison and then after. And I think like the sad reality is like that sense of self is fundamentally what makes you feel stable. So it's like what you said, right? Like having your life planned out for you is the norm for most members of society. And then to lose that at 21 years old, especially in such an unexpected way, I think really opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, I wasn't the first or last person to go through that. And I think it was the fact that like I was grateful for it in hindsight. I think it took me like 5 to 10 days of being in actual prison to like really come to terms with it. But yeah, it's an ego death, and it's a sense of like, you know, your life will never be the same after that point. And coming to realize that is it's a heavy realization. It's just, yeah, feels fundamentally a heavy weight.
Are there any laws that would have prevented you from being a doctor had you gone back and pursued that as your path?
So you have something in the UK called the GMC, the General Medical Council, and they exist as sort of like a, I guess, like a licensing body or an authority that sits over doctors. So while there are many doctors who are convicted of crimes who can go back to practicing medicine, there aren't many medical students where that's the case. So the difficulty was like, as a medical student, I was struck off by the GMC after I'd been released from prison. So it'd be very difficult, if not near enough impossible, for me to go pursue that career in the UK again.
So while you were incarcerated, were there educational opportunities offered to you?
Yeah, there were many, in some ways weren't fit for purpose. So in the UK, you have like level 1, level 2 qualifications. So these are like your most entry level qualifications. I did as many of those as I could really get my hands on. But you also have distance learning, which is a way you can learn when you're still in your cell or like in prison. And I ended up doing one of those courses later on in my sentence. But I think prison itself isn't a very conducive environment to becoming educated, in the sense that like both culturally, the environment and just the general like vibe of the place is one where you can't really focus, right? Like, and for those who get degrees and stuff in prison, I highly commend them, because in that environment, you don't get the resources, you don't get the access. So it's an uphill battle from the start.
I had perfect situation for going to school, and I struggled, and I used to think, how does anyone ever do that in a prison atmosphere where you
Yeah.
have constant noise and the schedule you can't keep for yourself, your schedule's already set for you, and it makes it very difficult. So I really respect students that are incarcerated, especially when they finish a degree, because it's really a difficult task.
Without a
Can
doubt.
you address a little bit about how you kept hope while you were in there and how you had change as far as what were you going to do with your future and what was going to happen next?
Yeah, so it was a Nelson Mandela quote that I read. It was like my first week or two, and it was like, don't judge a nation by how it treats its highest citizens, but by how it treats its lowest. If you want to know the truth of a nation, go inside its prison walls. And I think like reading that really primed me for my prison experience, because I learned to take the experiences like, okay, I'm an observer, a neutral witness in this experience that thousands of members of our society, in some cases millions, have to go through. And the luck that I have is because of my education and my background and my family, like I would be able to go back out of prison and still lead a relatively like quote unquote normal life, if that makes sense. And that really gave me hope, because I thought like everyone I spoke to, some of the situations for people in there were like, I think desperate was cutting it short, in the sense like, you know, they didn't have family anymore. Family weren't able to keep in contact with them. Like their addiction to substances had spiraled to a point where like even in prison, they weren't safe from their addictions, or like the trauma some people had experienced, I thought was like relatively unfathomable when you talk about it in like the normal lens. When I think about what mainstream society experiences trauma and then you experience from people in prison, it really opened my heart in a way. And I think that really gave me hope, because I think in environments like that, situations like that, you get to see your own true character, if that makes sense, because you are seeing, when you're stripped of nothing, do you choose to assimilate and, you know, to ostracize those who you don't belong to or don't relate to, or do you choose to find what connects you, if that makes sense? So a lot of the guys around me were the reason that I had hope, because, you know, they went out of their ways to take care of me, or like to make sure I was eating okay, or make sure that I was looked after in an environment where I was alien. And that made me realize, like, in a place where you expect to meet bad men, you still meet people who are just inherently good. They've just encountered bad circumstances. And I think the other thing was like talking about how that related to what I did when I came out. So for me, it was like I felt like I owed a part of myself to the fact that I had survived this experience and also been able to thrive during it. So for me, it was, how am I going to be able to use this as a way of like, and I don't like the word giving back necessarily, but to serve society. And I think that Mandela quote really showed me people in prisons are witnesses. Like, we're witnesses to some of the most horrendous things in our society, and we have a duty to take what we've witnessed and share that with the wider world. So doing that through my work, as well as like figuring out how we help those people who are the most forgotten in our society, because a lot of them, they aren't seen as deserving by the mainstream public or, the media. And it's like, how do we build those bridges for people? So that really empowered me coming out. And I think that also became sort of my mission, which is like, how do you bridge that gap for people in a way that doesn't feel like saviorism, or doesn't feel like, you're giving out handouts. It feels like you're teaching people how to build capacity to direct their lives in a way that they could have done had they not encountered some of those more horrible situations.
I like the fact that you brought up the types of people that you run into in prison, and the fact that there is a camaraderie there, and that people do take care of each other. And we have this misconception about people in prison that they're these horrible, awful people, but they're
Yeah.
not. They're just like you and I. They're our neighbors. They're our sons and daughters. So that's one thing that I have gained myself by being in contact with so many people that are in prison. I'm amazed at the kindness and thoughtfulness of those inside. I know how much it costs to buy a greeting card, and when you're making pennies an hour, to get a greeting card from prison is a huge gift. I save every single one of them because I know that it really took a lot for that person to be able to earn that money to send that card to me. And the other thing was the idea of, it's not giving back, it's our duty to our other fellow human beings. We are all on this road together,
Yep.
whether we agree or if we have differences in faith or culture, customs, whatever. We're all living, breathing human beings who want to do one thing: live a decent life and suffer as little as possible.
Yep. Spot on.
So now that we are talking about misconceptions of people in prison, could you name a couple of things other than that, about other people that are in prison and the idea of second chances?
Yeah, of course. I think one of the biggest misconceptions is around this idea of like individual responsibility of like, people are so oftentimes, especially sort of on the right of the debate around criminal justice, people often say people choose to commit crime, therefore they must be punished. And I think there's so much nuance and context to that, in the sense that, if you're someone who's grown up in an environment where poverty was the norm. And I remember there was a friend, so when I grew up in London, kids would rob phones, right? And at school, I would always be one of those kids who'd fight with kids who'd rob phones. And the reason being, in my head, it was like, you're stealing a phone that someone's mum or dad gave them. And I remember talking to one of my friends in prison, and he said, for me, it was a choice between stealing phones or having cereal and water for dinner. And when you get that in your mind, it's like a child shouldn't have to decide between a hot meal and stealing someone's phone. Like, that shouldn't be. And if I haven't experienced that level of poverty, then who am I to judge or to even think that that child is deserving of punishment? And that was a key theme for me, which was, you can't imagine being in those circumstances till you've been in them. So don't judge those who have. And our criminal justice system takes a really poor view of people who are in that. The other bit is like stuff like addiction. I think, again, like addiction is something that can be prevented when we are tackling that as a public health issue. But when we criminalize things like addiction, you cause this vicious cycle in people's lives. And, you hear this, like, we differentiate things like addiction based on social class. If there's a celebrity who's addicted to cocaine and drugs, and alcohol, we see it as like, oh my God, they're quite edgy. They just need to go to rehab, sort their lives out, and they'll be okay. And where if a poor person becomes addicted to crack and heroin, they become, a crackhead or scum of the earth, and they deserve to be thrown away and the key to be thrown. I think prisons, and I'm going to speak for the UK here more so than the US, but like they've become places to replace mental health facilities. So we don't have enough space in mental health facilities. So those who are mentally unwell are being sent to prison instead, because, it's a cheaper, less resource intensive, and that causes this cycle of crime. And we always have to ask ourselves, where do people fall on that? I think another big misconception is like the most dangerous people are the ones who are obviously dangerous. And it was really interesting. So like officers who'd worked in sex offender jails would say they often found sex offender jails easier to work in than in general pop jails or with sort of majority like gang offenders or drug offenders or violent criminals. The idea behind that was that those who often get sent to sex offender jails don't present as dangerous, but they may be dangerous in their behaviors when it came to sexual behavior. But those who present as dangerous, society deems as dangerous. So it's almost like looks and the way people talk can be quite deceiving. And I think one of my most profound and scariest realizations and misconceptions was around offenders who end up killing their wives or children, or like in what they call in the UK crimes of passion, right? And sometimes these men were the most normal men you would find in the prison. So like your bankers, your lawyers, your doctors who had that one break and they'd end up murdering their wife or their kids. It really opened my eyes to the fact that when you ask someone like, do you think you're capable of murder? Do you think you're capable of robbery? Or do you think you're capable of, violent crime? When someone says that they would never be capable of that, I'm now more suspicious of them than when someone says, do you know what? I think I could be, but I'm glad that at this moment I'm not. And that real distinction happened in my mind. And the second chance thing is really interesting is I believe that the only way we're able to give people second chances, true second chances, is by keeping an open heart, regardless of the offense that they've committed. But what we see in society is a very narrowly open heart, or a closed heart in most cases, saying a second chance is just a job or it's housing or it's like these very practical things. But the reality is, if someone doesn't feel accepted and welcomed back into their society after doing something wrong, it hardens their hearts and it hardens society's heart. And I think of it as children, right? Like if you if you've ever been around children and your child misbehaves and your attitude is, do you know what, you did that thing and I don't love you anymore, like that has an impact on the child. And we're doing that as a society to thousands, if not millions of people every year who are being released, which is not treating them ever the same or not giving them that chance to redeem themselves, or recognizing that like making mistakes is inherently human as well.
Thank you so much for addressing all of those issues. They were spot on for what I was looking for. We're going to take a quick break here just to bring you a few messages, and we'll be right back.
Attention. Choreo, a better way to connect with loved ones who are incarcerated. Without Choreo, family and friends wait for a call and hope they can answer. With Choreo, inmates can call or message at any time. When your inmate calls their Choreo number, they will hear your voice and text messages. Inmates receive and leave messages at any time using standard prison phones, making connection easy and predictable. For information about Choreo, visit choreo.org. Stay connected.
Music by Stir Crazy Music. www.stircrazymusic.com.
Is there anything that you are doing in your work right now that you would like to talk about? Do you have any writings going on or special speaking engagements? What's going on in Sobanan's life today?
Great question. So I think there's a few different things. I think so I've got a book coming out next year called My Prison Gap Year, which is about my experience of the criminal justice system. But I think beyond that, like one of the biggest areas of interest for me currently is AI and emerging technologies in criminal justice. The reason being is I think what will define our species or our civilization over the next few decades is how we use these really powerful technologies in spaces like criminal justice, because you can imagine a world where you have AI run prisons, robots running prisons, and people being locked up, and the prison industrial complex growing into this behemoth industry where anyone who participates in civil disobedience or opposes sort of government regulation is thrown into custody and managed by an automated regime. And you can also imagine a world where these technologies are able to provide abundance and health, and they're able to nourish our population and heal people in prisons. And I think what really interests me is what is the culture of the societies that adopt these technologies and what direction they go in. So for me, I guess what's interesting in my world is I spend a lot of time thinking about these problems. We also do work with like a number of governments as well as like the UN and stuff on this. And what I find really interesting is it depends on our populations. Like if your country is very punitive and believes that, criminal justice is a very black and white issue and evil people should be locked away, the way these technologies will be adopted will be at the detriment of not just the people in prison, but the majority of people in that society. So really encouraging people to think about these things, because I think if we don't, we're doing them a disservice by not warning them of what's to come.
Now, when you're talking about AI, are you also talking about virtual reality?
Yeah, so AI, virtual reality, all of these emerging technologies, so like AI being like, if you imagine the brain of them, but yeah, virtual reality falls into this, robotics, 3D printing, the whole host of sort of these very new and powerful technologies.
There's such a demand for a workforce, at least in the United States. And with 1 million people in prison, that workforce, if they could be paid a livable wage, not slave wages. I want to clarify that. That's one thing I would like to see more of. And also with the virtual reality, I use an Oculus, and I used to suffer from seasonal affective disorder. I had a really tough time in January. I just dreaded it coming. And my husband had seen some stuff about virtual reality, and he bought me an Oculus. It, to me, was a life-saving device. Exercise was excellent, but virtual travel. And I can't imagine what that could do for people that are incarcerated or in a hospital,
Yes.
some type of treatment facility where you have very drab colors all the time and nothing changes. To be able to experience, and that's what it was. It was an experience. When I went to the jungles of Africa, I felt like I was there. And I think about the mental health aspect of that and how much they could probably decrease their cost by investing in some of these devices and use the meditation techniques and some of the virtual travel. And again, exercise. I know somebody who's lost a ton of weight boxing. So there's some really great things. And I know we're talking about it in many other ways. And another thing is, I think for training staff at prisons with virtual reality before they ever are in the prisons, to have that feeling, because you can feel someone coming behind you in virtual reality. You can hear them breathing. You can hear their footsteps. So to be able to understand that hypersensitivity that happens when you're walking in a hall in a prison or down the street.
100%. What's really powerful is like it depends on the culture of what's being trained, right? Because I don't know whether prison officer training in the US is similar to this, but in the UK, I think a lot of it is pushed as like, don't trust people in prison. Don't ever build a relationship with them. And I think all of these narratives, I think, can be countered using some of these technologies. Because like the reality is yes, dynamic awareness is super important, but how do you balance dynamic awareness with being able to create a positive culture in a prison and everything else? And a lot of the times I feel like these technologies without the human element of like what you've described, the aims being mental health support, workforce development, meditation, if these aren't the pre-existing goals, then the technology can be used in any way, because the technology isn't neutral. It depends on who and how they're deploying it, right? And which will be interesting to see, especially in the prison estate.
So can we talk a little bit more about your book? When is that coming out?
So current release date September 2026. To do with and it's just, I guess, like I really found prison as a very spiritual experience, in the sense that being stripped away from all of those identities, being thrown into an environment where you're told so much about the outside. I think being able to articulate it from my lens is what I really wanted to do with the book.
It's funny because my next question was going to ask was, did you have a spiritual base before, during, and after? And did that change? And did your perspective change as you went and grew?
A great question. So growing up, I was brought up Hindu, and like being from like a Sri Lankan Tamil family, like Hinduism was sort of the religion of the majority. So yeah, that was what I was growing up. And then I think as I sort of like growing up in the UK, like we had to do Islam as a GCSE when we were in school, for example. And that was just like particular to my school. And then like you learn about the other religious faiths. And I've never been someone who's shied away from religion as a overall term for a bunch of spiritual traditions, and like learning to like find what works for you within that. And then in prison, what really opened my eyes was like everyone's religious faith helped to guide them through that experience. So whether they were Christian, whether they were Muslim, whether they were Buddhist or Hindu or whatever, like that helped to create some form of sense of foundation and stability and some sort of connection with themselves that helped them to be better people during their sentences. And that really opened my eyes, and I discovered something. It was quite recently I discovered this. There's this idea of omnism, which is like the idea that you have every single spiritual faith or religion has fundamental truths and tenets that apply across the board, but ultimately we're all on the same journey to death or like to the next life or home, whatever you want to call it. And ultimately, like, it's the goal of omnism is to find these continuous truths across all bases. And like that's what I feel like I've practiced since being in prison and coming out. Is I wouldn't say I identify as a single faith, but I identify with that human desire to connect with something greater than itself, if that makes sense. And that is, yeah, that's what in a lot of ways what's guided me up until this point.
I love that term. And I actually talked to my daughter afterwards when we had a conversation
Yeah.
before, and she says, that describes me perfectly.
No, I love that. I feel like there's a younger generation of people who really resonate with this, who don't necessarily identify to a single faith, right? And it's like I'm really glad I found a word for it, because it is, I can imagine that being some form of like actual future when it comes to a lot of people wanting to be inclusive.
Well, it's funny that every religion has a greater being, whether it's creator, God, Allah, whatever we give them as a name. So why do we think that one faith, religion, or belief is the only one when we all, I don't like to use the word worship, but for a better word,
Yeah.
this entity, and who is to say that somebody, especially like, I look at some people that are so strong in their faith, and I'm thinking, now wait a minute, they're not Christian. So if you go by the Christian Bible, they're
Yeah.
not going to have
Yeah.
the reward. And I see so many other faiths that are so strong in their beliefs. I cannot believe that there is a God that would punish them for feeling or believing something different.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think like the idea that any one group of humans has dibs on God, I think is like in itself, like it's comforting for that group. But it's also like when you think of this as like if a child born in Bangladesh, because they were born in Bangladesh and they're born to a Muslim family, does that mean that they have less of a chance of getting into heaven than a kid born in Italy to a Catholic family, or a kid born? And like I think when it's based on geography, culture, background, like we have to, as human beings, I think I like read like there's like been 30,000 sort of documented religions in the space of like recorded history. To argue that any one of those is more correct than another is like fundamentally a false premise, when you can't falsify the existence of that faith or that like the cultural nuances. If you look at how much religions evolved from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice to societies to where we are today, I think religion and faith evolves with humanity, and part of it is accepting that to allow us to evolve, if that makes sense, because otherwise it's easy to stay stuck.
Well, and things were so different thousands of years ago when some of
Yeah.
these religions came about.
Yeah, without a
So
doubt.
we had no idea of what the world was going to be. And it's really hard to think about, well, how could that book still be, the book now?
Yeah.
It. I've really been kind of surprised they haven't revised some of the religious texts to reflect modern times. I mean, they have the language, but to add to the books.
Yeah, I think it would become too controversial. I think the part of what gives religion its comfort for people is the fact that it's based on something that is like so far before our time. It's almost like, oh, okay, it must be true from that point, if that makes sense. And I think
Yeah.
part of it is like we don't apply that lens to any other form of knowledge, if that makes sense. So like even if you look at like Buddhism or Hinduism, like the faiths, like they are ways of life more so than they are religions, right? Like they aren't necessarily predicated on a single book. It's more humanity evolves, the idea of consciousness evolves, and you evolve with it. Whereas I think when you base it on single text, the danger is you become more of a zealot than you become someone who's faithful. And I think faith is fundamentally to accept the unknown, whereas like becoming someone who becomes obsessed with following something to the letter of what it says, like whether that's faith or whether that becomes like almost a sense of like a way to ease the suffering of life, right? Because there's a hope that in the next life things will be easier.
And we have to have hope now.
Yes, we
And
do.
there are many that believe that our physical existence here on earth is heaven, that
Yes.
that's our reward, that we get to have this physical existence. And if it is our reward, we should be making the very most of it.
Without a doubt. It's interesting to think, right? Like, I think when you make that perspective shift to the human experience being like not entirely, it doesn't have to be entirely positive because the contrast is what gives it beauty, but like it's the ability to appreciate it, I think is something that's definitely missing. Because even in the Buddhist noble truths, like all living is suffering, right? And you can understand how that is fundamentally true, but at the same time, suffering can bring with it joy and suffering can bring with it pain. And those two are just like, yeah, a natural thing of a physical existence.
Well, and there's those that say there would be no joy if we didn't suffer because we wouldn't recognize what joy is.
Yes, exactly. Hot and cold, any sort of contrast.
Boy, we've had some great conversations here. Is there anything that I might have forgotten to ask you that you would like to say before we wrap things up, or a message you would like to give those that are in prison on hope and keep going?
Yeah, of course. So I guess the message I'd love to give people is like the idea of being in prison, that idea of being a prisoner is something that we've fundamentally been told like is something that's stigmatized or something that as a story shouldn't be something that you should wear with a badge of honor. And I think what we have to learn to do, and I think something that society is learning to do, you see this online on social media, like wearing our worst moments with pride because it will teach someone else not to go through that. And it's one of those things where if you are in prison right now, use that experience, learn from that experience, and figure out what your message to the world is. Because when you get out of there, you have so much to give, and all of that depends on your self assuredness. And that comes from having survived a difficult experience in prison. So take your time to really understand yourself. And then when you get out, look for people online who are people who've been in your situation, who are making a positive impact, who are sharing their stories, because there's a world of opportunity that arises from that experience. And I compared, someone told me this when I was actually in prison. He said, you went from medical school to the school of life, and you will learn more about life during your prison sentence than you will learn from a lifetime of working a 9 to 5 job in an office and everything else. So take those lessons and share them with the world, because if we think about, if we're talking about religious text, right? Like if you think about some of the most profound thinkers in a religious text, they were the outcasts of society. They weren't the people who were from normal everyday life. And taking those spiritual or emotional or physical lessons from prison and sharing them with the world is a gift that you can all give. And just remember that what the suffering you witness in there, it's not for nothing, it's not frivolous. You have the opportunity to use it to do something good in the world. And and I hope you do use it, and that hope is always there.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Sobanan. I want to thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you, and I love the conversations that we had. So thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure.
I want to remind our listeners that you're listening to the Prison Pod. We've been talking to Sobanan Narenthiran from England today, and I really appreciate having him as a guest because we've really had a great conversation. We'll be back again next week with another version of the Prison Pod. Thank you so much for being here.
You have been listening to the Prison Pod, a podcast not just for those in prison but for anyone who has been affected by incarceration. Ms. Valerie would love for you to write to her with your questions, comments, and show ideas. The address is PrisonPod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine. 04473.